Just to start things off, these are the materials that I plan to use for my Inktober pieces. First of all, there's the paper. I am using Arteza mixed media pad. It's got a slight bit of tooth to it, which I really like for brush pens, which I'm going to go into a bit later. And I've cut them, the sheets, because this is an 11 by 14 inch book, I've cut it into sheets of 6.5 by 6.5 inch squares. And this is the size I'm going to work with. I have a tendency to go crazy with details, and so I know that if I gave myself the full 11 by 14 inch sheets, I would use it all and I would never finish these 31 pieces. That's why I'm cutting it down to a much more manageable size. So that's the paper. Now the pens, let's talk about those. Well, first of all, I do have a pencil because some of them I'm doing straight out with ink without bothering to sketch, but some of the pieces I am sketching out first. And so I have my trusty mechanical pencil. This is my favorite. I use Rotring, and it is a 0.5 lead. I also have a 0.3 lead that I use. It depends on how fine I want to get my details. This is my preferred 0.3 pencil. It is a Faber-Castell. And I usually use HB lead for my sketches to keep things light and so it doesn't get in the way and interfere with my how I'm seeing what's going to be emerging on the page. Now let's get to the pens. Well, actually, let's talk about the inks first. So I have, some of my pens I have just black ink, but the other thing that I am using is gray ink because I like to have the black and the gray and to be able to do some kind of shading with that, as you can see from this piece here. So I have this, which is Irene Gris Nuage, which is a gray that I have used in the past. I love it. It is a very warm toned gray, so it has a little bit of a purpley tint to it even, and it's very light and pale, which is what I want for this. I don't want a gray that's going to be too dark and compete with the black. And the other one I wanted to try out this year, I have not used this yet before. It's a different brand, it's a Pilot brand, and this ink, I sampled it a little bit, and it has a bit more of a cool tone to it. It's more bluish. And so that's a neat pair to have, one warm and one cool gray. The one downside I had with the Pilot is I thought it was a little bit too dark. I liked the Urbine one because it's very light. And so I tried diluting this one with a ratio of 2:1 ink to distilled water in here, which I am trying in my brush pen, which I'll get to now. All right, so pencils, paper, ink. Let's talk about the pens now. First up, I have this one, which is a fancy fountain pen. Although honestly, nib and nib holder work just as well. I just like something fancy to draw with every once in a while. But I have this pen currently filled up with, let's see, what do I have it filled with? I have it filled with the Urbine ink. The upside of using something like this is you don't have to pick any single one ink color to fill it up with, and you can just use whatever you wish at the time. Second, I have a Kuretake number 8 fountain brush pen. So this one is fillable with either a default black ink cartridge, which they come with, or you can actually buy converters, which allow you to fill it up with whatever ink you would like. I currently have black in here because that is going to be my black pen. And this here is the Kuretake number 13. It's pretty much the same thing as this as far as the brush tip goes. It's a little bit different, although I haven't noticed any difference in how it behaves. And this is essentially the same thing as this. It's just got a fancier housing for it, fancier body again. This one is cheaper. This one is, I can't remember, it's either $9 or $13. but it is a refillable pen, and these synthetic tips are amazing. I love these. I love these tips. If they made watercolors with these kinds of brushes, I would buy them in a pinch. And finally, I have a red gel pen, which I might use for little touches of red. It's Juice Up. I like these guys. It's also Pilot, actually. I didn't realize that. All right, so that's what I plan to be using. Now let's look at my actual tools of drawing here. I want to talk about why I choose to use brush pens. First of all, I am primarily a watercolor painter, so I am very comfortable most of the time with brushes. And secondly, I like brush pens because they give you a much more expressive line, because there's variation. You can get thick or thin depending on how hard you press. And secondly, let's take a close look at that tip. See how beautifully pointed that is and how sharp. I can actually get a finer line if I control this carefully with a brush pen than I can with a 0.3. This is a gel pen. And just to show you, here's the gel pen line. Here's 0.3. And this is my brush pen. Not only can I get the thin, I can also get this thick. So I have a much more versatile tool here than I do with just a pen that has a single thickness, and it's so much more expressive as well. Now, you'll notice that when I pressed down thickly, I got this broken up texture, and that is because of the paper I'm using. This paper has a bit of a tooth to it, as I mentioned earlier, and that, for my purposes, is actually a really good thing, because it allows me to do these. If I move my brush across swiftly like that, I can get this broken texture, and that allows me to shade. It lets me use this pen on this paper as a tool for shading, not just have black or white, but have gradations in between if I so choose. So that's why I really enjoy using this paper, particularly for the purposes that I have in mind in this for these drawings. Now, if I want to have it, dark black, I can actually just go over it enough, and that fills in all the little bumps and gaps in the paper, and then you can get some pretty solid black that way. You just have to go over it a few times. But I like this. I like having that choice of whether or not I want solid or broken up for lighter bits of shading. My other pen, I mentioned I have one pen that's filled up with gray. So this pen, the one I just showed you, is black, and that's just with the default cartridge that this Kuretake pen comes with. Now this one is filled up with my custom mixture of diluted ink. This is called a converter cartridge. It lets me fill up a brush pen with whatever color I choose, or whatever color mixture I choose. So in here I have gray, and again, because it's a brush pen, I can get these very thin lines, and I can also get thick lines, or even these broad sweeping strokes if I move my brush quickly, which is great for doing like these grassy tufts. And I move it quickly, and I want the ground to be broken up a little bit, the texture like that, and I can get these thin stalks coming up. You can see there's a lot of versatility within a single brush than within a single pen. Now, I like to use the gray and black in combination to get some shading on my pieces. And finally, I have my fountain pen. This is a Pilot Falcon, and the cool thing about this is it is also a tip that has some kind of flex to it. So it can do these thin lines, but I can also press harder and get slightly thicker. Not as thick as a brush pen, but enough that there is variation so that it is not quite so mechanical as I mentioned before. Now I thought I had filled this up with my Urbine Nuage Gris, but I think I had a little bit of brown from a previous filling. So it uses a very similar sort of cartridge that I had in the gray pen. Again, it's just filled with my own custom choices, and I had it filled with brown before, and I think I didn't clean it out completely. So when I added the gray, I have now this grayish brown, which I actually really like, although I'm going to have a hard time redoing a mixture that is exactly right like this if I want to repeat it for everything. But anyway, I think it gives a nice contrast to, it's a subtle contrast. I mean, these colors are all muted. I mean, I have black and gray and a brownish gray, which is sort of like a warm tone here. But it gives me nice variety to work with for my pieces while still maintaining a mostly monochrome type of look. Now these in combination are going to be what I'm doing for the majority of the pieces. Oh yeah, and one final thing, I did have this little red gel pen. You know, it's the same, it's a Pilot, so it's the same as that black one that I showed you earlier with this line, so it's a 0.3. Adds a little bit of color here and there maybe on some of the pieces where necessary. So once I have my sketch done, I begin by using my gray pen, my gray brush pen. This is just a brush pen that I have filled up with one of those two grays. I think right here I'm using the Gris Nuage. And this is sort of a undercoat layer of shadowed areas. And then after that, I start using the black pen and begin to pick out details and things. And what I want for this piece is for the bulk of the foliage in the upper part of this tree to be dark silhouetted, and that will let me showcase the glow of the fireflies. So now without any sort of darkened background, you can't really get that contrast, which is why I had to figure out some kind of composition which would let me have a lot of dark areas that let that light contrast out and show. Now I switch back and forth between filling in that background area and doing the fox, which I also drew with a lighter colored ink. Having these different neutral tones allows me to have some kind of variation in my tone so that I'm not strictly dealing with black and white, although much of it is that. You have to take that into account when you're working with ink. Really think about your shapes and your negative space, because that's going to dictate the composition. But having some grays allows me a degree of freedom from those restrictions. And these little fireflies, or these little sparks, I guess they could be more distant fireflies, I'm doing by slowly working my way around each of those gray splotches that I did in underlayer, with the black overlaying it, and then you won't be able to see the edges of that gray once the black is all filled in around. So I don't need to cover the entire area with gray, I just need to cover the spot around that little bit of light. Here, zooming in a little bit so that you can see better what I'm talking about. And I work in this circular shading fashion around each of these little sparks. Here's a little close-up of one of the fireflies, starting out with sketching it, and then I lay in that gray, And then after that, I use my lighter gray pen just to fill in some details on the Firefly's body himself, and then slowly shading in the external area. And for the final piece, of course, this melds into the larger black area of the tree. But for this little example, I'm just having it end in this circular formation. I want to talk a little bit about some inking techniques, some things that you could do with line work. So ink is primarily either black or white. That's what scares people sometimes, that there's no in-between shading. But there is actually lots of ways that you accomplish in-between shading with it. You do it via texture. And one of the ways I mentioned with this brush pen and with a rough paper is that you can simply move your brush across the paper quickly, and then you achieve this dry brush shading. Another thing you can do is called hatching. So if you start off with all your strokes parallel and going in the same direction, and then you overlap the previous layer slightly with each successive layer, you can accomplish this shading. And I'm lightening, I'm pressing less with each of these layers as I go, so I actually can get even this sense of gradation from dark to light. I can make this upper area even darker. Now with my Firefly piece, here's a little test drawing that I did. I wanted to have this sense of the inner part being very light and moving out to the darker external area. And so in order to accomplish that, I did, basically it's this hatching technique of shading, where, but it's, instead of being in a straight plane like this, I'm working around the edges of a circle. So in order to do that, I have to start first with the inner circle. And I'm making my lines go parallel outwards. And then the next layer. And then the next layer out from there. And one of the things I discover as I work, and it might not be the same for you, it's just the way I handle the brushes, is that when I do a brush stroke using this brush pen, when I do fast ones anyway, like this, I find that I'm much heavier or darker on the starting end of my stroke than on the tail end of my stroke. So you see the top here is kind of a darker bit of ink, and the bottom part is lighter and thinner. So I use that to my advantage when I'm doing a shading like this, where I start, because I want the inner part to be lighter, I start from the outside and move inwards into my circle from all angles as I do this. And once I get a little bit of a base in, then I can lightly go around and start to do more shading like this with my fast moving brush. just to blend things a little bit better and to make it more of a seamless transition. And of course, eventually I would darken my outer edges all the way to complete black. I'm not going to do that currently. Because this paper is rough, there's a lot of dry brush action that happens, as you see. If I want to have my black more solid, one thing you can do is just dip very quickly into water, just like that. Just a little quick dip. And that gives your ink a much more solid look for a temporary bit. So you can do that to really darken black areas. And it'll go back to its normal consistency after a little bit. But that helps to blend out this black outer portion. So that's the technique that I am using on this Firefly piece. And I'm using it on all these little lighter areas, and I will be using it on the actual fireflies themselves. One other thing that you'll notice that I did on my Firefly piece, though, is that instead of starting from white paper, I actually started from initially a blob of gray. Because I didn't want my center to be bright, bright white. I wanted it actually to be gray. And so I just do this blob of gray, and I let it dry first, because if you don't let it dry, what's going to happen is, just like with watercolor, wet and wet, things will bleed out a little bit when you touch it. So you gotta let that dry, but once it dries, then I start basically doing this same technique around this gray, making sure that once I get to the outer edges of this gray blob, I am pretty close to the solid black portion. So this has to be larger than just the center little white dot. It has to be big enough to cover basically this whole area. So that's what I did with both this firefly as well as the lighter sparks on the tree that is in progress. So there is hatching and shading with dry brush. And that's a technique that you can work in if you are also doing some ink work or some brush ink work of your own. All right, back to the main piece. I'm basically applying that same technique over and over again to all these fireflies. I think there's like 10 of them or something, which for me is a small amount. Sometimes I do 100 of a single creature in one picture. I'm thinking butterflies and stuff. It's amazing. I haven't driven myself crazy doing that. All right, so lots and lots of little fireflies. And I'm using the gray and the white and the black to give myself 3 tiers of light, of contrast, of tone in this. So I want the fireflies themselves, the entire firefly, to sort of have this nimbus of light around them, but not so bright that it eclipses the bright pinpoint of their lit up tail, lit up back end of their abdomen. I don't know what you call it. Anyways, so to that end, I'm doing these circles, these semicircles around the larger fireflies, and then leaving this bright white around the actual lit up portion of them. The circles around them, around the entirety of their bodies, that's more a compositional element, because I like the visual of these sort of bubbles of gray, these larger ones, as well as these little tiny ones that spark off to the sides. So this allows me to do that, because there's some stylization going on here.
And filling in all of this dark area gets a little tedious. But slowly make my way around. Filling in all that stuff. The thing I like about using this paper, I mentioned this at the start, but you can see it in action here, even in these dark black areas where there's a tiny little bit of a mottled, speckled texture to it. And I can fill that in entirely if I want, just by wetting the tip of my brush and letting the ink, which is not waterproof, blend a little bit more. But I like that speckly look, which gives it sort of this little sparking life. In this little section of the tree, I decided to take a chunk out of it just to break up the symmetry. And then it's back to the little fox, which I had previously drawn in with the lighter gray ink in a nib. And now I'm going back in and fleshing it out, really using the black to make the outlines much more pronounced because I want him to show up more. At that point early on, I wasn't quite sure how dark I wanted him and how much contrast there would be against the background. But once I get all the other elements in, I can more accurately judge that. So a lot of this stuff is just sort of happening as I go. I have some ideas planned, like I knew I wanted the large silhouette of the tree, but the exact areas of lights and darks, I don't really plan that out until I have more of the piece filled in, and then I can sort of react as I go and see what's going to work best in terms of the overall composition and what's going to make the piece more striking. Things like that little chunk that I took out of the right side of the tree where I broke up the symmetry, which looks like, there's this bite taken out there. And these little fireflies, I'm using the lighter toned gray to do them, just so that they're not completely dark, and it helps them stand out a little bit more against the black of the silhouetted tree. Just a few black highlights on them though, dark lights.